Good morning. We're going to read from Deuteronomy again today. This time our passage is from Deuteronomy 6, verses 4 through 9, and you can follow along I have it in the app if you want to follow along there, and these are words you might be familiar with. So, Israel, listen, our God is the Lord, only the Lord. Love the Lord your God with all your heart, all your being, and all your strength. These words that I am commanding you today must always be on your minds. Recite them to your children. Talk about them when you are sitting around your house and when you are out and about, when you are lying down and when you are getting up. Tie them on your hand as a sign. They should be on your forehead as a symbol. Write them on your house's door frames and on your city's gates. So when I was thinking about this, spending a little bit of time in Deuteronomy, I knew that this passage was one that we were going to spend a week looking at. This is a really, really important passage. It even has a name of its own. This is called the Shema, which the Shema really is just that first Hebrew word that starts this passage, and it means hear. So to hear or to listen. This text is really at the heart of the Jewish faith, kind of the way that the Lord's Prayer is recited in several Christian traditions where they would recite it each week. This is something that's recited frequently in Jewish communities. Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God, the Lord is one. You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, and with all your might. Observant Jews would recite this twice a day, in the morning and in the evening, just as the passage instructs. Recite them as you are lying down and when you are getting up. These are really important words. They're repeated liturgically, they are said together and sung together, and when they do these words together, this shapes a community. Sometimes these instructions of Moses were even followed literally. Write them on the door frame of your home. These words are actually written on the parchment that is encased in the little mezuzahs that Jewish families would hang on the door frames in their homes. When we traveled in Israel a few summers ago, every hotel that we stayed in, our hotel door room had one of these on the door, and it was just so wonderful. It's this physical, visible, touchable reminder of the presence of God that you see and feel as you're walking in and as you're walking out. Calling to our attention to it. Listen, the Lord our God, the Lord is one. Love the Lord your God with all your heart and all your soul and all your might. The passage also says to tie them on your hand as a sign, that they should be on your forehead as a symbol, and these things were literally acted out. These words are also written on tefillin, or these little phylacteries, little leather pouches, boxes that were on straps that people would tie around their foreheads and tie around their arms in order to remember these important words. At the Israel Museum, when we were looking at the Dead Sea Scrolls exhibit, this was one of my favorite things. They had found teeny tiny little fragments of these things that had been tucked inside of boxes, and they had little boxes there as an example that people would actually tie around their heads. This is such an important text. It was literally practiced in physical ways to help Israel remember. Physical reminders are really helpful when it comes to remembering. It's the same kind of thing as like tying a string around your finger to try to remember something. In his farewell address before he sent the people that he'd been leading through the wilderness for 40 years into the promised land without him, Moses called them to remember. And the Shema is kind of the way that he's summing all of this up. Listen, hear. These words are not like a suggestion. It's not like, hey, listen. It's more like, listen up. This is really important. These are the words to remember. As Christians, this is also a really important text because it helps us to make this big connection between the law of the Hebrew Bible and the gospel teachings of Jesus. In the Bible app notes, I also included the text from Mark in which Jesus is being asked, what is the most important commandment? And how do you suppose Jesus answered? He quoted the Shema, The most important one is Israel, listen. Our God is the Lord, the one Lord, and you must love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your being, and with all your mind, and with all your strength. And the second is this: you will love your neighbor as yourself. No other commandment is greater than these. So the way that Jesus approached his faith and answered his call to live out this embodied faith in the world has its roots in Deuteronomy. In all three of the synoptic gospels, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, all record Jesus having this interaction, being questioned about what was the most important commandment, and answering that with love God with all of your everything and love your neighbor as yourself. So kind of like Moses did in Deuteronomy 6, he just kind of pulls it all together, sums it all up. In Matthew, Jesus says that this is the sum, the entirety of the law and the prophets can be stated in these two things: love God and love your neighbor. These are the core values that we don't want to forget. I think it's really beautiful how the Shema calls us to wholeness. The love of God is not just intellectual, although it involves all of our intellect. It's not merely emotional, but it engages all of our emotions. It's not merely physical, but it takes all of our physical strength. It's a call to wholeness and to oneness. And how beautiful is it that the God who is one calls us to be one, to embrace our whole selves in our love of the divine. Moses urges the Israelites to remember and not to forget. And to ensure that they don't forget, he encourages them to practice this over and over again. Recite it to your children when in your comings and your goings, and you're lying down and you're getting up. Remember that loving God involves your entire self, your heart and your soul and your strength. Practicing something every day encourages the development of muscle memory. Anybody who's learned how to play an instrument or who's learned a skill like knitting or crochet, at first when you start out, it's really awkward and it's very hard and you have to think a lot about what it is you're doing. But the more and more that you practice it, the more it's like your muscles just figure out what to do and it becomes more natural. When you practice a task over and over again, your muscles begin to remember. And this is why habit is so important to pay attention to, because the things that we do over and over again become automatic, kind of like our body just does whatever it's going to do without us really thinking about it. So I was wondering this week if maybe that part of what it means to love God with the whole of your heart and your strength and your mind is found in this. The more we practice this love, the more that we love with our whole selves remember. It's not something that we have to think about each time, that love becomes an embodied response, and it becomes as automatic as breathing. I wonder also if our gathering for worship and the words that we read and we say and we sing, the ways that we care for each other when we gather help us to develop that muscle memory that we can take with us out into the world and live out. I think that might be a big part of our call to a faith community. Finding people that help us to practice the love of God and the love of our neighbor. Last Sunday, we had our first gathering with the youth, and they had some really good questions, which I think they always have really good questions if we pay attention. But one of the main questions was, why do we need this? What's the point of this? Why do we get together? So this week, I've been thinking about that question a lot. I've been thinking about how this practice, in some ways, is kind of the point. We get together and we practice being people who love others in a safe space. And we practice letting other people love us in a safe space so that then we start to develop that muscle memory. And it becomes easier for us to embody that love and to live that love out in the world. I mean, we don't always experience love and acceptance in the world when we're out and about. And so it's kind of good to practice these things in a place that we know we are cared for and safe. And so maybe engaging in a community of faith is about practicing the kind of loving humanity that we want to see more of in the world. And by practicing, we just naturally begin to become agents of that love beyond our community, where our hearts are less protected, in places where love seems even countercultural. This muscle memory can help us to live it. And a lived love of God, in the way that Moses speaks, engages our entire selves and our whole lives. I love the way that Deuteronomy's remembering involves actually wearing our love of God. Tie it on your hand, wrap it around your forehead. I've been thinking about ways in which we might wear our love of God. And so this week I've been wondering if tying something physically on our arms or on our heads is something that we need to do, or if it's more about our love of God being just something that is written all over us as we engage with people in the world. I mean, we say things like this, don't we? We say, that was just written all over your face, or you just wore your heart on your sleeve. Maybe that's what it means to have an incarnational faith. We embody the love of God so that it is visible in ways that we love our neighbor. We've been remembering these past few weeks during worship. We remembered our origins, where we've come from, and how we've come to be here at this time. Last week we remembered our identity, and we looked at our bylaws kind of as a jumping off point to explore who we are in the world when we are at our best. What kind of values do we want to pass on to our next generation? What kind of things do we want to teach those people that haven't been with us for our whole journey? What do we have to offer? This week, I hope that in our remembering, we can focus a little bit on our call stories. Many of you have a call story on how you have found your home here at Wellspring. It's been beautiful to hear these stories and to see how these stories intersect with Wellspring's story. This week, as I've thought about call, I've been pondering how Wellspring has a call story that's made up of all the individual calls that each of you are answering. This week, I've been pondering all of this. I've been thinking that Wellspring continues as we continue to engage and to listen for that call and to act on those calls in the way that the Spirit is calling us, because call is something that is ongoing. So what does a call require? Shema. It requires that we first hear. In order to answer a call, we have to listen. Hear, O Israel. We have to hear it first before we can respond. And maybe that's another part about being in a faith community. Surrounding ourselves with people that help us to kind of tune in and to listen to those promptings. This week I was reading a commentary by Sue Lowcock Harris that really hooked me, and I was trying to figure out how to weave this in, and then I decided I just am going to share with you a little quote that she wrote, because it's really been sticking with me this week. Both the way of Judaism and the way of Jesus begin with this word, Shema Israel. Hear, O Israel. Hear, O church. Our core identity is not that we are people who do something. It is that we are people who hear something. We hear something distinctive, clear, and whole that orients us toward a way of life. How do we position ourselves in the world so that we can hear this voice? How do we turn our heads? In what direction shall we crane our necks so that we can listen? And in this listening, hear. What assistance do we need to hear this voice above all other voices? What noisy static might drown out its song or obscure its clarity? Whatever the answers, What sets apart the Jewish community and the Jesus community is that we have made a commitment to be transformed into people who hear the voice of the divine. Isn't that beautiful? Those questions about what we hear and then what we do with what we hear really just hooked me this week. And maybe they can provide us with a little bit of inspiration as we remember and explore our call stories. So now I invite you to enter with me into a time of remembering. This can be your call, your personal call, or a call as a congregation. This might be something that was a call from a long time ago that had you landing here, or it could be some direction that you've been sensing or pondering or feeling that we might be pulled or you might be pulled now. And so, how have you experienced call? Let's remember together.